Hello everybody and welcome back to another brand new video where today I'm going to be reviewing the Doctor Who Series 12 soundtrack, which is of course released this Friday. I got the soundtrack a little bit early, I got a bit lucky, Silver Screen just by chance I guess happened to send out the soundtrack early for people who pre-ordered straight away, so I actually got mine just over a week ago, last Monday. So I've had the last week to be able to listen to it, enjoy it, and also have a think about it so that I can give you guys a good, in-depth, honest review of what's good about it, what's bad about it, and just, overall whether it's worth a purchase or not. I think the first thing worth saying is I think that the Series 12 soundtrack is definitely, or the Series 12 scores in general, were definitely a step up on Series 11. Where Series 11 wasn't bad, and I did enjoy some of the stuff in Series 11, I think 13's theme was a really good addition to the programme. And yeah, there were some good musical pieces in that. I feel like as a whole, the music it just wasn't as noticeable as what we got used to with Murray Gold, where you always knew when it was a Murray Gold track, or whether you recognised that theme, or that action music, or something like that. That was always there and so acknowledgeable in the moment, and you knew it straight away, compared to second scores in Series 11, where there was a lot of kind of background repetitive synthy type music, which was prevalent in Series 12 as well, but to a lesser extent, because he did bring in, I think, a little bit, to an extent, more orchestral and just more kind of themes to really fit different episodes. So as we go through the Series 12 soundtrack, I talk a lot more about that, but I think having both character themes and just styles of music that fitted the different episodes better, and having more variety in it, I think just made an overall better soundtrack for Series 12 than what we saw in Series 11. So I think the easiest way to do this review will kind of be just to look through each of the episode soundtracks and kind of talk about them a little bit, what tracks are highlights and things like that, and then I'll give you my overall general highlights and lowlights potentially of the soundtrack as a whole at the end. But I think the first fundamental thing to say is this is a much better effort than what we saw in Series 11 as a whole for the music generally, and in terms of the stuff released on this soundtrack. Like, there are tracks in there that you will remember from the series and you will recognise, and that are brilliant pieces of music on their own. I think that's the key thing. Anyway, let's get on with Spyfall Part 1 straight away, because there's no time to waste. Well, first off, they've got the Series 12 opening titles on there, which are subtly different. I mean, I haven't personally noticed massive differences. I think it's slightly different, the sort of bass is slightly different on it, but it's not massively noticeable, but it's really nice to have. And also worth noting that at the end of the soundtrack, at the end of Disc 2, there is the Ascension, the Sidemen end credits, including the middle 8, which is quite significant, which was, as I say, played at the end of episode 9, so they could have the big, long Next Time trailer. It's the first time we've heard the middle 8 in a while, and it's the first time in forever that they've actually released the middle 8 on a soundtrack, so it was really, really cool to be able to have that, to have the complete kind of theme music, both start and ending, and all the different versions of it that we've had so far. It's really, really good. And then, yes, Spyfall itself, I think, is one of the strongest scores on the whole soundtrack, to be honest. It is very much calling on slightly sort of Bond-esque style, the very sort of orchestral and sort of horns and things like that are included in it. It's just got such a recognisable style to what you're kind of familiar with general James Bond scores and soundtracks, which I think is a really, really good thing, because it just means that they can have that bit of variety. Then we go to Orphan 55, which I'll come to a little bit, and it's something completely different in terms of the way it's scored. But yeah, for this particular one, of course, we have the main thing is the Master's theme being introduced for the first time, with the whole 6-minute track of the Spy Master, which is the full Master reveal scene at the end of the episode, including them all running up to get on the plane in the first place, and then the whole music through that right to the very end of the episode. That whole big theme of music is there to enjoy, and it's cracking. It's one of my absolute highlights of the soundtrack. You've also got the proper James Bond kind of style theme for 13 when they turn up at the at Daniel Barson's house. That piece of music is on there in full. There's some really nice music from earlier on as well. The very, very first piece of music from the whole series that opens the pre-title sequence is on there. And it's worth noting, quite the insane thing I saw in a little video with Sega Nakanola, is that the first few notes on the very first track, the first few notes of music you hear in the whole series, are a version of the Master's theme. They put in there straight away those first few notes. It's such a great thing. I love it when composers do little musical things like that. There's another one of those coming up, which I'll mention later in this video. But yeah, and there's just various different versions of the sort of James Bond-esque themes and the Master's theme all crammed into Spyfall Part 1. And then Part 2 continues that vibe as well, along with the really, really interesting music at the end of the episode when the Doctor finds out about the lie of the Timeless Child, or finds out about the Timeless Child and about Gallifrey being destroyed. And this fantastic variation of 13's theme that we haven't heard before is just... It's so sort of ominous. You hear the music when she turns up to see Gallifrey destroyed for the first time, and then the Master talking to her in this sort of hologram type look. That's all included on there and sounds absolutely fantastic, I think. So that completes the Spyfall 2 episodes, which we get 12 tracks in total, or 11 tracks in total from that, plus the opening theme. And in general, I felt it was a really, really strong soundtrack. There wasn't any, at least from those two episodes, noticeable pieces of music where I was like, why didn't you include those? And that is generally a thing of this whole soundtrack. There hasn't really been any noticeable. Well, there's one omission in The Timeless Children, which we'll get to right at the end of this video, but in general there hasn't been any like big tracks where I've gone, why on earth did you not include that? Because surely that should have been on there. That was one of the best pieces of music for the whole series, which has so often been a problem with previous soundtrack releases, but I feel like on this one they really have for once kind of got it right. And so we come to 155, which is something, as I mentioned, so completely different. We go from this quite heavily orchestral type music that we've had through the James Bond-esque big orchestra style music for Spyfall parts 1 and 2, and then we cut to 155 and it's synthesizers everywhere you look, basically. All these fascinating and really weird different sounds that are combined into creating music. I think Segen talked about how he used some really unusual methods. He went out and recorded ambient sounds in London to create a synthesizer from, and using weird sort of guitars and things to sort of input and just create really, really weird and unique synthy sounds. It was almost like that was his kind of experimental scoring episode, I think. Whereas, and it was quite interesting because even when I did, obviously in the episode I didn't really notice the music that much, and even when I did the complete soundtrack of this, because of the layers and layers of sound effects of trash that were layered over it, I didn't really notice the music that much until I listened to it on the soundtrack. And it's not my favourite stuff in there, but it is very much really quite interesting and quite different and unusual in terms of that just being quite experimental synthy stuff. And the music that plays under the very, very ending of the episode, the Doctor's not good speech, but the actual music to it I feel like is really nicely scored. It's these really just subtle pulsating synthy beats that really kind of just flow really, really nicely, and then it transitions into the nasty sound of the dregs that we hear throughout the story as well, which, yeah, so it's just quite an interesting musical enter there. There's one other thing related to that I'll talk about a little bit later on as well. But yeah, of 55, I think it's got about sort of 10, 12, 13 minutes of music, whereas Spyfall's got like 25 or 30 in total. But it doesn't need that much, quite frankly. But it's still a reasonably interesting piece of music, even if it's not probably my favourite of the soundtrack particularly. So next up we come to the score for Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror even. Apologies, I always get that wrong, and I probably will never get that right ever. But there's 5 tracks on the soundtrack for it, around 15 minutes of music. I'd probably describe it as similar in vibe to the soundtrack to Rosa. It uses that similar kind of mix of orchestral plus a bit of synthy stuff in there to kind of mix things up a little bit. I mean, I think pretty much all of Segen's scores have an element of synthesizers within them. That's just very much an element that he's very heavy on, compared to Murray Gold, where there's always going to be an orchestra and occasionally something like a synthesizer as well. It kind of feels like that's been a bit reversed with what Segen's done with the music, which I don't think is any bad thing at all. I think it can work really, really effectively. And yeah, there are some quite exciting pieces of music in this episode's soundtrack. I think the last 2 tracks, Superior Minds and The Future Is Mine in particular, are very, very strong pieces of music. They're sort of the Superior Minds in particular is the kind of action-orientated music when the Doctor and Tessa are working together to try and defeat the Skithra Queen. And there's also a bit of the theme of the Skithra in there as well, which, I don't know, it's not my favourite piece of music. It's kind of a little bit too much, I think, to an extent. It's kind of these very, very heavy, rapidly played strings that are kind of layered over and over and over and over and over again into just a sort of cacophony of noise is probably the best way to describe it, which I don't think creates that effective of a piece of music. I think it kind of works in the episode itself, but on the soundtrack it's not really anything to write home about particularly. It's kind of like you just want to get past that because it's just this kind of messy noise slotted in between some nice pieces of music. But then also the quite nice piece of music towards sort of end the episode when they're talking to Nikola Tesla about his future and what's going to happen and things like that. There's just some more calm and subtle sort of light orchestral music in there, which I think fits the vibe really, really well. And it's just a really nice piece of music to kind of close the episode out, I think, as well. Now, next we come on to Fugitive of the Jadoon, which has got to be one of my favourite scores of the series and is really, really well serviced in the soundtrack. The only noticeable omission for me was the music at the beginning of the episode when we see Ruth walking to work, that really rather funky and unusual piece of music. That isn't included in any form on there, unfortunately. But apart from that, there's several variations of Ruth's theme within Fugitive Identified, The Lighthouse, and Something Is Coming For Me, 3 of the 5 tracks that are included. Of course, there's the music for the Captain Jack reveal as well, which everybody wanted to be able to hear. And I just think that in particular, The Lighthouse, the music for the Ruth Doctor reveal, is probably my musical, or certainly one of my, if not my musical highlight and my favourite track on the soundtrack. Just kind of when you listen to the music and then you remember the scene and what was happening when you were hearing that and what we were seeing, I think it just really adds something extra to it, and it's just the real excitement and the action and the shock of there's this secret Doctor, the TARDIS is buried underneath the ground, and all of that being revealed I think is just so perfectly scored. The interesting musical thing I wanted to mention earlier was within this piece of music, sort of quite late on, there's actually a subtle variation of the Masters theme that's dropped in, which Segen talked about was a way to kind of throw you off the scent there for momentarily. You suddenly hear in the Master theme, you're like, oh, maybe this isn't the Doctor, this is actually the Master, just as a kind of way to do it within the music, which I think is such a cool and clever idea to be able to do, just those subtle kind of musical Easter eggs almost that are thrown in there. But overall, I think as a whole, that track is absolutely wonderful. It really is such a brilliantly exciting and shocking track, really, I think, in the way it's done. It's very synth heavy again, as I say, but it's just that intense pulsating beat, and the sort of it just really keeps building throughout the 5-minute piece of it as well. And then the last track as well, Something Is Coming for Me, really kind of, you get to feel the kind of Doctor despair, I think, within that piece of music, because it's very much, it's her the final scenes of the episode where she's talking about something is coming for me, hence why it's called that. And it, I don't know, it just really punctuates that scene so well, and really just fits on the soundtrack, I think, really effectively as well. So we'll get rattling through a few more of these. Praxis is a story where I don't think the music was particularly noticeable again in the story, and it's nice to have these 3 tracks on here. In particular, the highlight is Gabriella's theme, which is initially that kind of vlog style music that we heard in the episode, and that's included quite nicely on the soundtrack, and it's actually a really good piece of music, but then it's kind of rehashed into a more instrumental type vibe, a sort of synthy instrumental thingy in the background that's used in some of the other tracks from Praxis as well. And it's probably is a really strong piece of music. I think works really effectively within these sets of tracks. But apart from that, there's some nice kind of actiony, intense type music in there, but it's not, it kind of fits for me a little bit more with Orphan 55 in the style, and it's nice, it's fine, but as a whole that soundtrack doesn't do that much for me. And to an extent the same with Can You Hear Me as well, which is a little bit different in style. There's really sort of weird sounding music when the kind of we see the Eternal turn up and his fingers are coming off, and that really sort of intense sounding music that we hear there is quite interesting, but isn't really that sort of enjoyable a listen necessarily, I think it's probably worth saying. But the highlight is probably the final track of Can You Hear Me, called It's Not Just You, which is all about those final 5 minutes when we see the various companions having their sort of past explained and things like that. Let's dump some character development in 5 minutes. But the music is quite nice for it, and there's a really nice variation of Yaz's theme that's dropped into there as well, which I think works really well. And yeah, it's just a really nice kind of calm, emotive piece of music, I think, that fits really well at the end of the episode. And then we move into the final few episodes with Haunting of Villa Diodati, where we've got 4 tracks from there, so it's not got a huge amount of music from it, but it has got the critical things. It's got the music from the moment the Sideman is first revealed, that brand new Sideman theme that's been introduced in the programme, which I actually really like. I think it's really quite different. It's certainly very different to what we're used to with the Murray Gold Sideman theme. And it's just such a kind of unnerving and sort of off-putting, but in the best way, type of piece of music, because it's got such an unusual timing to it. And the heavy sort of drums that are almost coming in, because it's such an unusual timing. It's kind of the drums are beating in and out when you're not expecting it at all, because you're so kind of untrained to that sort of the way the time is playing out there. So I feel like it just really can sort of take you off kilter a little bit, as it were, when you're listening to it, and when you're watching it within the episode. It just adds, I think, that extra threat, that idea of the real sort of crashing drums of the sort of steel and metal of the Sidemen, I think, is such an effective way to score them. And particularly, as I say, in that first reveal scene, it works so well, and is really well realised on the soundtrack as well. And the final track as well, She Was the Universe, when the lone Sideman manages to escape, and then we get the final scenes with the Doctor and the sort of nice poem being read underneath that. There's some really nice effective little variation of 13's theme included in there as well, which I really enjoyed. And so we come to the final 2 episodes of the series, probably my favourite scores. I mean, I'll confirm that in a minute, but essentially the Sidemen includes a nice, more than I was expecting, of the various Brendan scenes and the sort of nice violin type music that we've got throughout there. Both the tracks Brendan and The Fall and Some of Everything Is About to Change include the various moments of music from Brendan. The first scene with him at the early on in the episode when he's a baby and growing up. Then The Fall is, of course, the scene where he gets shot and falls off the side of the building. And what's noticeable, I'm pretty sure, I'm not just imagining it, that there is subtly at one moment just a few little notes of what turns out to be the Time Lord theme in the following episode, The Time of Children, which I'll get onto in a minute. It's literally just 4 or 5 notes of it, but I think it's in there, and it's just that kind of subtle thing you can look back on and go, they've just hinted at it in the music there, that this is something to do with the Time Lords and Gallifrey, because they've used the Time Lord theme just very subtly in there at that point. So I thought that was very interesting. And as I say, there's also the variations of the Sidemen theme as well that's thrown in there, and really kind of, I think, taking up a notch from the previous one. It's almost like in Haunting Villa Diodati, it's kind of one version, it's quite a sort of subtle theme because it's only the one Sideman, and then it feels like with Ascension they've thrown it, almost like they've layered it over and over again, and added so many more bits and elements to the theme to kind of show this is now an army of Sidemen, not just a single one of them. And I think it just really adds that beat, that oomph, that impact to it that it really needed in that episode, essentially, the Sidemen, and so it works so effectively. The only thing of note is the final track, Everything's About to Change, doesn't actually take the music right through to the very end of the story. The final few seconds, so it has the music for Gallifrey's being revealed again, but the final few seconds when the Master turns up on screen and you get that literally just a few notes of the Master's theme, that's not included within this track. But it still doesn't really particularly affect it for me. I think it's still a very, very strong episode of soundtrack. And then so we come to the final episode, The Timeless Children, and the music for that, and it probably is, I think I'm going to say, it's my favourite soundtrack of the whole series, just with the the new Time Lord theme that's introduced in this story more than anything else, I think is what makes it for me. That it's got 6 tracks on there on the soundtrack, and I think every single one of them has got some real great exciting moments to it. All the music of the reveal of who the Timeless Child is, and the Timeless Child being the Doctor, and all of that is included on this soundtrack, and I think works so effectively. The brand new theme for the Time Lords in the track called Time Lords, unsurprisingly, is such a wonderful, it does feel like a theme for Gallifrey. It feels very kind of royal. It's got a real kind of beauty to the piece of music. I feel like it could still fit with This Is Gallifrey in terms of the style of the music. I might at some point try and do some sort of mishmash of the Time Lord theme from Timeless Children and This Is Gallifrey, because I feel like they can work really, really well together. And there's just some real intense excitement in there. Probably my absolute highlight of the whole soundtrack, I know I said The Lighthouse, but maybe my other secondary one is Cybermasters, which is, it creates an absolutely perfect variation and mix between both the Cyberman theme and the Time Lord theme combined into one together at the same time, and yet it works so perfectly. Then they introduce the Master's theme halfway through that piece of music as well. It's just absolutely excellent. It's one of the most exciting and intense and brilliantly conceived pieces of music I think throughout this whole series. It just works so effectively as a piece of music just to listen to, not even as part of the story, I think. Now this episode is probably where there's the one piece of notable music that's missing that I was a little bit disappointed by. So the track Sidemasters I've just mentioned continues not just through the scenes where we see the Sidemasters for the first time, but also through the Ruth Doctor scene. We get her theme, and then through the few moments that the Doctor's kind of figuring out what's going on inside the Matrix. But so frustratingly, it builds up, it builds, and then it stops. Literally at the moment we're about to burst into the theme tune that was included in the episode, it cuts off and stops at that point, and it fades out, and then we move on to the next track, and that's been skipped. So if you were hoping that variation of theme tune was going to be on the soundtrack, it's not. I'm really sorry, but it's not at all. Literally, it builds up to that moment, and then it's just not there, and we skip through to My Penance, which starts off the whole scene when the Doctor goes to meet the Master for the final showdown, essentially, which does have the really nice subtle 13's piano, a variation of 13's theme in the piano style. Just the subtle piano notes played are all included on there as well. But yeah, unfortunately that version of the Doctor Who theme is not on the soundtrack. But yes, so that concludes the soundtrack, a soundtrack that I think is a real step up on what we saw in Series 11. As a whole, this soundtrack is very well put together. It's got all the tracks you were hoping would be on there: Master's theme, the Ruth reveal, all the stuff from the Timeless Children, as well as Sideman theme. Every single piece of music I think you'd really want, apart from, as I say, that variation of the Doctor Who theme is on there, which is great news. If you've got any thoughts or any comments on which tracks are in there, and if you're worried about whether a piece of music is included or not, please do comment down below and I'll do my best to tell you that. But apart from that, of course, the soundtrack's released on Friday. It'll be on Spotify. You'll be able to buy it or whatever, I guess online or something like that. I don't really know. But you'll be able to listen to it wherever you like. It does exist on YouTube already, so if you really want to go and listen to it, you can just search Doctor Who Series 12 soundtrack, and I'm sure you'll find it somewhere. But I didn't say that. But yes, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. As always, hit the like button, the subscribe button if you're new here, and I'll see you again very soon for a brand new one. Goodbye.